On August 13th, 1984, in the quiet town of Blackfoot, Idaho, two inseparable 12-year-old boys, Eli and Micah, set off on what they thought would be a routine summer adventure. Their families lived on neighboring farms, and the boys were as close as brothers, spending long days chasing frogs, climbing trees, and imagining the wildest stories. This day was no different, or so they thought. The sun hung high in the sky, its warmth beating down as they trudged toward the stream with jars and nets in hand. The plan was simple: catch frogs, maybe bring one home to spook Micah's sister. Laughter echoed between the two as they walked along the dirt road that skirted the edge of town. But their cheerful banter died down as they approached the old Renshaw House. The house was infamous in Blackfoot, a crumbling, two-story wreck surrounded by dying weeds and an eerie silence. It sat far back from the road, as though it were trying to hide. People whispered about the tragedies that had taken place there. A family vanished without a trace decades ago, leaving behind only a blood-stained nursery. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was haunted, but all agreed on one thing: stay away. "Let's just go around it," Eli muttered, his eyes flickering toward the decrepit structure. His voice betrayed a slight tremor, though he tried to sound nonchalant. "Scared?" Micah teased, nudging him, but his grin faltered when a faint sound drifted through the still air. A voice, small, soft, and trembling with fear. "Help me!" The boys froze. Eli looked at Micah, his heart hammering in his chest. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," Micah whispered, his face pale. "It's a kid." They stood rooted to the spot, listening. The voice came again, fragile and desperate. "Please, help me. I'm in the basement." Eli wanted to run, every instinct in him screaming to get far, far away from the house. But Micah's jaw tightened, and he started toward the porch. "Micah, no! We should get someone, like the sheriff or our parents." "There's no time," Micah shot back. "What if she's hurt? We can't just leave her." Eli's feet refused to move. He watched as Micah stepped onto the rotting wooden porch, the boards creaking beneath his weight. When Micah turned to him, his eyes were fierce. "Are you coming or not?" Eli swallowed hard and forced himself forward. The door was already open, sagging on its hinges. Inside, the air was thick and stifling, carrying the stench of mildew and something fouler. The boys exchanged a glance before Micah called out, "Hello? We heard you. Where are you?" "Basement," the voice answered faintly. "Please, hurry." The house seemed to close in around them as they entered, the sunlight outside fading to a murky gloom. Furniture lay shattered and overturned, and dark stains marred the peeling wallpaper. Eli's hands trembled as he gripped his net tighter. The basement door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. It seemed to breathe, a faint draft whispering through the cracks. Micah pushed it open without hesitation. The stairs beyond descended into blackness, and the air grew colder with every step. "Stay close," Micah said, his voice steady, though his hands clenched into fists. Eli nodded, gripping the banister as they crept downward. The basement smelled worse than the rest of the house, a vile mix of damp earth and something metallic. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting weak light across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, and the boys scanned the space with wide eyes. "Where are you?" Micah called, his voice echoing. "Here," the voice answered, but it sounded wrong now. Too soft, too flat, as if it came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Micah, I don't like this," Eli whispered, his knees trembling. "We should go." But Micah was already moving toward a dark corner of the room. "We can't leave her," he said firmly, his footsteps crunching on the dirt floor. That's when it happened. Something moved above them, a flicker of black against the dim light. Eli froze, his breath catching in his throat. Before he could scream a warning, a shadow dropped from the ceiling, landing silently behind Micah. It unfolded, grotesque and alien, its limbs too long, its eyes gleaming like polished onyx. "Micah, run!" Eli shouted, his voice breaking. Micah turned, but it was too late. The creature lunged, wrapping its spindly arms around him. Micah's scream echoed through the basement as Eli stood paralyzed, unable to look away. The creature opened its jagged maw, its teeth glinting, and buried them into Micah's neck. Blood splattered across the dirt floor. The sight snapped Eli out of his trance, and he screamed his friend's name. "Micah!" The creature hissed, its head snapping toward Eli. Its black eyes locked onto him, and he stumbled backward, tears streaming down his face. It let out a guttural growl, then retreated into a jagged hole in the wall, dragging Micah's limp body with it. Eli's legs gave out, and he crumpled to the floor, shaking and sobbing. The silence that followed was suffocating. He didn't know how long he sat there before the world blurred and faded to black. When Eli was found hours later, he was curled in the corner of the basement, clutching his knees to his chest. His hair had turned stark white, and he whispered Micah's name over and over. Eli spent months in the hospital after that day. His parents tried to coax answers out of him, as did the police, doctors, and even the town priest. But Eli couldn't speak. Words refused to form, trapped behind the wall of horror that had swallowed his mind. When he finally regained fragments of memory, it was in fits and starts. Flashes of Micah's face, the gleaming black eyes of the creature, the terrible hiss that still echoed in his nightmares. The house was searched thoroughly, but no trace of Micah or the creature was found. The authorities chalked it up to an animal attack or some kind of trauma-induced delusion, though whispers in the town said otherwise. Parents tightened curfews, warning their children to avoid the Renshaw House at all costs. For Eli, the house became an unspoken presence, a shadow that followed him wherever he went. By the time he was 22, Eli had built a fragile semblance of a life. He'd moved to a neighboring town, found work at a hardware store, and rarely spoke of his childhood. But the nightmares never stopped. Every few nights, he would wake drenched in sweat, hearing Micah's voice calling out to him. "Eli, help me," it would say, faint but insistent. One night, he woke up screaming. This time, the dream was different. He saw Micah standing in the basement, his clothes torn and bloodstained, his eyes wide with fear. "Eli, it's not over," he said. "Come back." The dream haunted him for days. He tried to shake it off, but a gnawing feeling took hold of him, a pull he couldn't ignore. He needed to go back, not just for himself, but for Micah. Deep down, he felt it. Micah was still there, trapped in that house. The decision wasn't easy. Eli knew no one would believe him, so he didn't tell anyone. One cold November evening, he packed a flashlight, a crowbar, and a knife he'd bought at a pawn shop. He drove back to Blackfoot, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The town hadn't changed much, but it felt smaller, quieter, as though it had been drained of life. When he reached the Renshaw house, he parked far down the road and walked the rest of the way. The house loomed in the distance, more decrepit than he remembered, its windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the world. He hesitated at the edge of the yard, his stomach churning. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but he forced himself forward. The front door hung open, swaying slightly in the wind. Eli stepped onto the porch, which groaned under his weight, and peered inside. The stench of decay hit him like a physical blow, stronger than before. He gagged, pulling his scarf over his nose. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself were alive and watching him. He made his way to the basement door. It looked just as he remembered, dark, gaping, and wrong. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the crowbar tightly and descended the stairs. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and his flashlight cast jittery beams of light across the dirt walls. "Micah!" he called, his voice shaky. The only answer was the sound of dripping water. He scanned the room, his heart pounding. Everything looked the same. The sagging ceiling, the broken furniture, the hole in the wall. The sight of it sent a chill through him. That was where the creature had disappeared. And now, 10 years later, the hole was wider. Something moved in the shadows, and Eli froze. He gripped the crowbar, his palms slick with sweat. "Who's there?" A soft voice drifted out from the darkness. "Eli." His breath hitched. It was Micah's voice, unmistakable. "Micah!" he shouted, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Where are you?" "I'm here," the voice answered, closer now. "Help me." Eli stepped toward the hole, his chest tight with hope and dread. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the jagged edges of the opening. It led to a tunnel, narrow and winding, disappearing into blackness. "Micah, I'm coming," he said, crawling into the hole. The tunnel was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of rot. Eli's flashlight flickered as he moved forward, his knees scraping against the rough ground. The further he went, the more he felt something watching him. He turned, but the tunnel behind him was empty. "Eli," the voice called again, weaker now. "Please hurry." He crawled faster, desperation fueling him. The tunnel opened into a cavern, and Eli froze. The space was massive, its walls glistening with moisture. In the center stood Micah, his figure silhouetted against a faint, unnatural glow. "Micah!" Eli shouted, scrambling to his feet. But as he approached, something was wrong. Micah didn't move. His head hung low and his arms dangled limply at his sides. Eli reached out, his hand trembling, and touched his friend's shoulder. Micah's head snapped up, and Eli recoiled. His friend's face was hollow, his eyes black pits that oozed thick, tar-like liquid. "Eli," Micah rasped, his voice distorted. "You shouldn't have come." A guttural roar echoed through the cavern, and the walls seemed to shudder. Eli turned, his flashlight catching the creature as it emerged from the shadows. It was bigger now, its limbs longer, its teeth sharper. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance between them in seconds. Micah lunged at Eli, his movements jerky and inhuman. Eli screamed, swinging the crowbar wildly, but it was no use. The creature and Micah closed in, their shadows swallowing him whole. The next morning, the Renshaw house was gone, leaving behind only a crater and a silence that hung heavy over Blackfoot. Eli was never seen again, but on quiet nights, locals swore they could hear a voice in the wind, a boy's voice calling for help.